This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. We're starting off today with something that's just about everywhere, but you might not think about it every day. It's something that has a surprising importance to nearly every aspect of life, including national security. It's a choice that underpins how well you can understand any message and even conveys a message itself depending on how it's set up. And even if you think it's a small choice, it inspires some big debates. We're talking about typefaces, or as they're more commonly known, fonts. We come across dozens of typefaces every day, from emails to street signs to advertisements. Different fonts are everywhere. We're going to unpack a bit about the crucial role fonts play in both design and accessibility, but first, as we said earlier, fonts have national security implications too. Earlier this year, the US State Department announced it would be switching its standard typeface from Times New Roman to Calibri. The Washington Post broke the story that Secretary of State Tony Blinken sent a message out to US embassies with the subject line, "The Times New Roman are a-changin'." Microsoft Word users might know that Word made the same switch from its 2007 edition onward, but the State Department's switch ruffled some feathers. Thankfully, we did have someone on our team who was able to look at how that switch would impact us. Our political director, Andrew Rafferty, is here. He knows all things DC and has done a bit of reporting on the subject and checked in with the State Department. Andrew, why did the State Department make this switch and what were they hoping to accomplish here?
Hey, Christian, the State Department made this change as part of what it calls its commitment to making the workplace more accessible for those with a range of disabilities. The State Department told Scripps News in a statement that they worked with disability inclusion advocates on this change and are hoping to set a model for other government agencies to do what is best in terms of accessibility. Now, the way they see it is that Times New Roman can be hard for some workers to read. And if you're using a technology that turns a picture of a page into a readable or audible text, for example, the little edges on the letters in Times New Roman can make it harder for that assistive technology to figure out what letter it is. Considering how potentially sensitive some of these diplomatic cables can be, there really is no room for error when it comes to interpreting anything that is sent on diplomatic cables, regardless of the font. The change is pretty wide-ranging too. Secretary Blinken asked for all the documents submitted to him and to other high-ranking officials be in Calibri instead of Times New Roman. And that actually applies to US embassies overseas as well. Now, the State Department also told us that they want this to be a sort of demonstration of their allyship for those with disabilities. They told us that, the idea that this message of including people with disabilities should not be, quote, restricted to any given month or period, but something that should be pursued all year round. Christian?
All right, many thanks for that update, Andrew. Accessibility played a big role in the State Department's decision. Let's break it down for you. The switch to a larger font makes it easier for people with varying degrees of visual impairment, including those with near or farsightedness, to read what's being typed out. Calibri is also considered a better font for people with dyslexia to read, and it's easier to interpret for screen readers, which is technology that reads on-screen text as audio. Quick side note about the terms font and typeface. While they are related, there is a difference. To explain that difference, we chatted with graphic designer, YouTuber, and font expert Linus Bowman.
The distinction used to be much more clear before digital fonts or digital typefaces. So a typeface would be something like Helvetica, and a font would be a specific size and weight, like Helvetica Bold, 10 point. And this, when we had physical type, like metal type, they were like physically separate kind of specimens. These days, the files that you install on your computer are all fonts, and but a typeface, you can kind of, in an analogy, think of a typeface like an album and a font like a track on that album.
So today, the words fonts and typefaces are used largely interchangeably, which is what we've done and what we will keep doing. Okay, getting back to it. There are several key factors that go into a font and how it looks, including the spacing inside letters or between letters, for example, but we're gonna focus on what are known as serifs. Most fonts you might use fall into two categories, serif and sans serif. Serifs are the little lines or strokes that hang off letters in certain fonts. Like in Times New Roman, the capital letters T and N, or the lowercase I, have little edges hanging off of them. But if you look at the same lowercase I in Calibri, there are no extra lines, which is why fonts like Calibri are known as sans serif. The prevailing thought is that sans serif fonts are easier to read. It's that kind of information that plays a role in the development of new fonts that cater to people with disabilities.
It's a project that I had a small part to play in, was a project with the Braille Institute of America on their font called Atkinson Hyperlegible. And that was developed for people with low vision and was focus grouped with those users in mind, with certain kind of character choices and design features that made it easier to distinguish different letters from each other. That was a particular project with a focus on making something almost like a Helvetica style typeface, but with more accessibility features.
Depending on who you're looking to accommodate, a font can be tailored to address their specific needs.
There are other kind of projects out there, like for other problems, like dyslexia, which it's another problem for them is distinguishing different letters, and they might having an exact mirror like a P and a Q or a B and a D can cause problems for people with dyslexia.
And it's not always the case that sans serif fonts are the most helpful.
There's also the context of reading. So are we reading short form? Are we looking at single words and lists, or short things, or are we reading a book where we get into a flow of reading? Your peripheral vision is picking up the letters, and it's starting to, you're focusing on word shapes instead of letter shapes for recognition. And that's long form because it's in flow state, so you have different needs. By the way, serifs are supposed to support that.
Accessibility consultant Gareth Ford Williams said he had to think about that a lot when he spent a decade as head of accessibility across multiple divisions of the BBC. He worked on designing BBC Reith, the font used across digital, print, and television on the British public broadcaster. BBC Reith is a sans serif font, but Gareth cited Amazon as an example of a company that relies on both types of fonts depending on the context.
Amazon is a great example of where they've thought about that, because this is why you see that, predominantly online when you're shopping, this is short form reading. You may be reading descriptions, but that's the longest thing that you've got, and it's very, very short form. And in those contexts, then often sans serif works incredibly well because you're dealing with a single word. You're not in a flow state. You're not necessarily looking for word shapes. And yet then when they go to the Kindle, Bookily is a serif font because it's supporting people's flow state and reading.
There generally aren't laws requiring the use of particular fonts, but there are guidelines that exist for how fonts can best be accessible in line with the Americans with Disabilities Act. For example, the Justice Department's ADA Standards for Accessible Design asks for signs with raised characters or display screens to use sans serif fonts. At the same time, there's a design element to fonts. Not every TV ad is going to use only Times New Roman. I mean, that might get boring real quick. But that's a big reason why there might be a greater incentive for the development of a wider range of accessibility-friendly fonts. Linus told us he thinks there should be more hyperlegible fonts that aren't just in the style of a pretty plain font like Helvetica.
We're hoping that actually this inspires more projects like this in different styles, because not every font is Helvetica. Sometimes actually a serif font is the right choice,